The call came just before sunrise, when the world still felt like it belonged to anyone brave enough to step into it. I was pouring water over coffee grounds when my phone lit the counter with the kind of number you only get once in a lifetime, and a voice I didn't recognize said, "Ms. Arden? We're calling from Beacon Site because your donor flag just matched a recipient by name, and then the name landed like a stone through glass, Noah Rains." And for a second I forgot how to swallow, because 2 years ago Noah broke my heart cleanly enough to leave edges, and now fate wanted to thread those edges with light. They said the match was rare, that my tissue markers aligned so perfectly the transplant board called it a miracle, that if I consented to an experimental bilateral procedure, my corneas could restore his sight within weeks. And I knew enough biology to know the words don't usually belong together, living donor and eyes, knew that the world respects borders like life and death. But the physician on the line spoke calmly about lamellar donations and limbal grafts, and a new protocol that used my healthy tissue to scaffold his damaged ones. And I pressed my palm hard against the counter and thought of Noah's last words to me. "You deserve someone whose future isn't a crime scene," and wondered if this was the only sentence that could rewrite that moment. I told the voice yes, because the truth was, I'd already donated so much of myself to him that giving sight felt like closing a circle, because once he had taught me how to see wonder where I'd only cataloged facts, because sometimes love arrives disguised as a bad idea that keeps refusing to leave. At the Beacon Site building, the glass smelled faintly of rain and citrus cleaner, and the man who met me in the lobby wore a suit the color of ocean fog and a smile that said he narrated other people's lives for a living. "Dr. Kellen Morrow," he said, extending a hand, the weight of a silver pen visible in his breast pocket. "I'm the medical director here, and our motto is simple. Vision belongs to the brave." And he said it with the confidence of someone who had named the motto himself. He knocked his desk 3 times before sitting, an odd, precise rhythm that made me feel like I'd stumbled into someone else's habit, and explained the trial I was already halfway inside, how Beacon's non-lethal protocol took only what the body could spare, how the risk to my sight was minimal but not zero, how the benefit to the recipient was life-altering. I signed because numbers on consent forms don't bleed, and because I had woken up that morning with the unshakable certainty that if there was even a sliver of a way to give Noah back sunrises, I would climb into that sliver and camp there, in the hallway, as a nurse fitted me with a band that would measure everything my heart did. I saw a woman my age staring at a wall of donor stories, and when she turned, recognition hit both of us at once. Leah, Noah's little sister, now not so little, eyes rimmed in red, mouth hard as if she'd been chewing on grief. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, which stung more than I had braced for, and then she was pulling me into the shadow of a door and saying, "He doesn't know it's you. He'd never let you do this if he knew." And I tried to answer with grace, to tell her I wasn't doing this to be let in or forgiven, but to be useful, to balance a ledger I hadn't asked to keep. And she kissed my cheek, quick, fierce, a blessing disguised as a warning, before disappearing down the corridor. Later, in the little pre-op room where walls pretend they've never heard regret, a nurse scanned my ID bracelet and a tray rattled softly. And when she leaned over me, a smell like bergamot and something metallic drifted under the mask. Citrus, I thought. Citrus and polish, and I couldn't place why that mattered until Dr. Morrow returned to review the plan, and I smelled it again. The same invisible signature from the hallway, as if the building itself wore his cologne. The procedure itself felt like falling into the kind of sleep that proves your body knows what to do without you, which is both terrifying and humbling, and when I surfaced, everything was night behind my eyelids, soft and padded and medically intentional. A voice in the dark counted, not to reassure me, but because repetition is sometimes the only kind of mercy, and later another voice I didn't expect brushed across my skin. Noah's. In the hall, muffled, asking if the donor had arrived, if the team needed anything, if he could sit near the window where the light was warmest.
And I remembered how he'd always found a window in a room that didn't have one.
I tried to lift the blindfold just to prove to myself there was a world outside now, only for a firm, gentle hand to press mine down. And I thought of all the ways his hand had once translated a city to me. Curb, puddle, fresco, sky, and the ache arrived with such clarity that I surprised myself by laughing, a wet sound that startled the nurse into honesty. "He's right there," she whispered, on the other side of the curtain. And I turned my face toward his silhouette and said the one thing that hadn't stopped being true. "Buy your future a good pair of sunglasses," which was our old joke. The kind you stitch into a life so you have something to hold when you can't hold the person, and I listened to him smile. The first red herring arrived as kindness does. Convincing, wrapped in exact language, plausible enough to wear a white coat. A week after the operation, while I was still learning to count the hallway by steps and echoes, I overheard Dr. Morrow assuring Leah that the donor's astigmatism had made the grafts trickier than usual, that a second minor surgery might be needed to polish the interface. And Leah, who had told me not to be here, nodded like a soldier, nods at a map, and asked how soon. And Morrow said, "As soon as the board signs off, we'll keep it quiet." And she didn't flinch at quiet. And I filed it under sister doing what sisters do, until that word began to glow later like a sign I had tried not to read. The second red herring freckled the world with coincidence. Noah's former partner, a broad-shouldered cop named Cal Dawson, visited once with flowers so bright I could feel the heat off them, leaned against the wall like a question, and told me in the low voice men use when they're about to mean something that he thought I was out of my mind, but he respected the physics of what I'd done. Yet he also asked strange things. Had anyone else approached me before the match? Had I noticed anyone following me in the weeks leading up to the call? Had I received any anonymous letters with the line, "Vision belongs to the brave"? And when I said no, he touched the brim of a hat he wasn't wearing and left a number I wouldn't call. And 2 days later, he called me anyway to say he had a bad feeling and then didn't answer when I called back after midnight because I'd woken from a dream in which elevators dropped without stopping. A different kind of cat and mouse began. Not the simple one where a villain wears a sign, but the modern kind where everyone looks helpful and the hallway smells nice. Texts arrived from an unknown number that said things like, "All bravery is consent," and a second donation would make him see stars. And when I showed Dr. Morrow, he frowned convincingly and said he'd loop in security. And then, almost as an afterthought, asked if I'd mind staying. One more night on the ward for observation, and I agreed because it's easier to be safe where the machines beep gently than it is to be safe at home where the kettle whistles and the door isn't locked from the outside. That evening, someone stepped into my room and stood still long enough for my skin to track them. A hand brushed my chart. The smell of citrus came and went like the tail of a comet, and I wasn't sure what I would have done if Cal hadn't appeared in the doorway with his inconvenient timing and said, "Doctor?" in a tone that means you should be somewhere else, and the air thinned around the figure. And Shoes retreated politely, and Cal sat beside my bed and said, "Nothing about this place creaks right." And I laughed, because sometimes laughter is a relay baton you pass to keep from dropping yourself. Days later, Noah's voice returned. Rehabilitation had begun to open light for him, like the slow draw of a theater curtain, and he sat in the chair by my bed and told me colors as if they were music. The green here is like an apple decided to be kind. The blue is like a secret. The white is not white at all, but a set of decisions the walls made. And I tried to picture his world colliding with mine. Tried to absorb the idea that he was looking at something he hadn't seen in 2 years, while the blinds over my life were, at best, set to dim. I asked him why he left me without a goodbye the night that split our timeline. And he said the sentence I had dreaded and longed for, "To save you." And when I didn't answer, he added, "I was undercover, June." I was getting close to people who specialize in turning bodies into markets, and I didn't want your face anywhere near the list they kept. When the crash happened and my world went soft at the edges, it wasn't an accident. I just told my handler the name of their medical director. And the night cracked open down the middle as he whispered it. Kellen Morrow. And all the little observations I had ignored arranged themselves into a confession. The citrus ribbon that braided the ward, the silver pen like a signature, the 3 knocks before the reassuring smile, the way he said the motto as if he'd invented it because he had. The midpoint wasn't a scene, it was a hinge. I had put my eyes in the hands of the man who had orchestrated the loss of Noah's, and a silence so thoroughly earned, it felt like art fell between us and then turned into a plan, because grief is a dead end and plans give grief a job. We decided to use him the way he used the world. If Morrow harvested bravery by wrapping it in consent, we would unwrap his consent in public and let the world see the kernel. We needed proof, and not the kind that bleeds stories, but the kind that convinces judges. Cal arranged a meeting in a place that smelled like damp wool and coffee, and he told us quietly that 3 other donors had signed forms here and never called anyone again. That Beacon's quiet second surgeries often happened after hours without the board's blessing. That a charity named Bright Forward received monthly transfers from a shell company linked to Morrow's brother-in-law. The dark night fell fast the moment we realized the second surgery scheduled for Noah wasn't polishing at all, but a pretext to harvest more tissue from me. that I was the source and his recovered sight was leverage. That the messages insisting bravery equals consent had come from a number looped through a phone in Morrow's office. That the soft knock at my door on the quiet night had been not a nurse doing rounds, but a habit. For an hour I hated everything, the sterile sheets, the word donor, the part of me that still loved the man who had left so I could live, the part of me that wanted to unsign forms. But then Noah touched the edge of my bandage with such careful certainty that I remembered how he once guided me through a blackout with only his voice. How he had left not because I wasn't enough, but because I was. And I made a choice I could live with and maybe not see through. I would become my own red herring. We would leak through Cal that Beacon had matched me to another urgent recipient who needed a second, unauthorized after-hours procedure. I would show up to sign. Noah would wear the comm in my ear and describe the room as if I were his eyes this time, telling me which way to turn, when to smile, when to stall. I would ask questions the way scared people ask them, honest enough to sound real, and we would record Morrow saying the quiet parts quietly into my collar. If it worked, good people would come through a door and end a thing. If it failed, we would hit the red bar labeled alarm and find out if the fire code is as brave as the motto. The night we chose arrived masked as any other. Morrow greeted me with don't worry teeth and the cologne of untroubled men, knocked the desk 3 times and said, "We'll keep this off chart. Bravery deserves privacy," which would have been a kindness if privacy hadn't been the cover for every terrible thing. I signed with a hand steady enough to trick even me. Noah's voice laced my ear, warm and focused. 2 steps left. The camera's in the fake smoke detector. Look for a vent with 3 screws, one is different. And I asked Morrow if it mattered that the board hadn't signed off yet. If there was any risk to my remaining vision? If donors had ever, he cut me off gently with a hand on my chart, pointing to a line that did not exist, and I waited a beat before saying, "The smell in here is different than last time. Did you change cleaners?" And he said without thinking, "We switched to bergamot." The other kind set off the patient monitors. And the fairness of the clues cheered me in a strange way, because here he was admitting the cologne disguised as cleaning solution. Here he was revealing the thing I needed on record. He controlled the room. He curated scent for compliance. He knocked to tell the anesthesiologist he'd arrived. Noah murmured timing into my ear like a metronome, while Morrow rolled pamphlets into a tube and tapped them against his palm like a man bored by consent. And I asked, in the tone of someone almost convinced, "Where does Bright Forward get its funding?" And he blinked just once. A tiny glitch in a machine that didn't expect its reflection to speak and said, "From benevolent donors who believe sight should be shared." And I said, "I agree." And he smiled before realizing the recorder in my collar had caught the exact words on the wall outside Bright Forward's office door. Benevolence is brave. And then the room leaned. And Noah said, "Now." And I did what people in movies do when nothing else will work. I swung my legs off the gurney and pulled the red bar and listened to the building scream like a conscience. The sprinklers came alive with the precision only water conquers, and footsteps clattered hard and unscripted in the hall. And Morrow reached for a drawer in that way men reach when their ethics live where they keep their weapons. And it would have been the part where things go bone dark if Cal hadn't arrived with 2 officers who still believed in paperwork, and if Leah hadn't stepped in from the corridor, jaw set, eyes fierce, and said the sentence that stole my breath. "You told me it was a polish." And I watched the world subtract the last bit of insulation from Morrow's voice as he faltered. Because the only thing harder to lie to than a judge is a sister who has decided to stop being polite. He backed toward the side door marked "Staff Only," hit a code with muscle memory, and I felt the draft of his escape plan start to breathe, and I made my sacrificial choice then because love often asks for a specific. I yanked off the bandage that kept my healing tissue safe and saw not light but the memory of it, a bright ache like a sun behind a curtain, and I ran blind toward the door and slammed the crash bar with everything I had, jamming it as it tried to lock. And the pain flared so white I thought the room would narrow and never widen again. And I kept my body there as a hinge, as a wedge, as a person-shaped refusal, until hands I trusted pressed in from the other side, and Cal's shoulder did what Oak does. And Morrow was pulled back through a doorway that had thought it belonged to him. And he said things to avoid saying sorry, and somewhere in the din, good people wrote down the words he used. After, in a room where the beeping returned to its small genre of reassurance, Noah sat and cried in that careful, quiet way of men who have learned to fold and unfold grief. And I told him I didn't know how much I'd lost by making that door a decision and not a warning, and he touched my cheek and said, "You didn't lose anything that was yours. You traded a piece of light for the kind of day where children wake up and don't get harvested, and I couldn't help it." I laughed a dizzy laugh and said, "You finally learned metaphors." And he kissed my forehead because he knew there were places not to go yet, and I believed it would be enough to be alive in a city that just got a little cleaner. Months quieted the story without silencing it. Morrow pled to things that will keep him out of rooms with drawers. Bright Forward shut its doors under different, quieter words. Beacon's board invited a different kind of doctor to teach them that brave is not a synonym for unsupervised, and a legitimate foundation funded the last stage of my recovery with lenses that translated edges into shapes. Sight returned like a tide that had learned manners, partial and stubborn, and enough to read the way Noah had changed, softer around the mouth, steadier around the eyes. We moved into a small place above a florist that slept in petals and opened a community room we called the window because everyone deserves one. And on Thursday nights, we let people read their own donor stories out loud so their voices could hang in the rafters like prayer flags. Leah comes sometimes and sits in the back and hums along to the coffee machine, and when the room empties, she hugs me in a way that tells me she forgave me before I forgave myself. Once a month, Cal drops by with pastries he swears he baked, and we don't argue with him because gratitude tastes the same, no matter who made it. On the anniversary of the day my phone turned coffee into a countdown, Noah took me to the pier at dusk, placed my hands on the railing like he used to place them on maps, and said, "Close your eyes," which still makes me grin because he knows that's not funny. And when I did, he put something cool into my palm, a small brass token stamped with a motto neither of us will ever use again, and asked if I would trade it for a ring. And I said yes while meaning more than a word can carry, and he cried that careful quiet again and then loudly, unfairly loudly when a gull stole our snack. And I kissed him because it had been the plan all along. And down the boardwalk, a teenager who'd just learned to read street signs without squinting held hands with a boy who signed to her that the night was a good color. And I thought maybe that's all a story is. A string of nights learning their colors, a set of doors refusing to lock, a woman who once donated her eyes to the man who broke her heart and discovered the heart had been breaking itself open to make more room for light.